Welcome back. The proceedings are again in session.
Yes, welcome back, everyone. Thank you. We'll now have a virtual presentation with Mr. Blair Hagan and Mr. Rod Giltaca. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this commission on behalf of Canada's National Firearms Association. My name is Blair Hagan, and I am Executive Vice President of Canada's National Firearms Association, Canada's oldest firearms rights and freedoms advocacy organization. Canada's National Firearms Association has participated in this process with a very serious intent of assisting this commission in identifying the real facts and exposing the real circumstances of this very serious national tragedy. We hope this commission accepts this assistance with our sincere spirit and intention of finding real solutions and pathways in preventing mass tragedies and acts of violence, such as the Nova Scotia mass casualty event, from occurring in the future. We have provided a history of the politics and failures of Canadian firearms laws and regulations over the period of the last 40 years, the reasons for those failures, and the civil disarmament agenda that gave birth to them. But frankly, we are confused by the Commission's focus and emphasis on the firearms issue, especially in light of the present federal government's legislative agenda on firearms. The perpetrator of the Nova Scotia mass casualty event was not authorized by law to be in possession of any firearm. He was completely outside of the scope of the Canada Firearms Program and all of the regulations imposed by the Firearms Act. He had been investigated and charged in the past and could not have purchased or possessed firearms legally. He was known to police. He had many run-ins with the law. He had been previously investigated for a variety of serious events. He was a recidivist who generated through his antisocial behavior and actions a very long history with the police. None of that mattered. The perpetrator planned this incredible act of violence for a very long period of time, carefully accumulating the tools and accessories he needed, unlawfully if need be, in complete contempt and total disregard for any law or regulation. The laws and regulations had no effect. It could not have had any effect, as the perpetrator had no concern and had not submitted himself to them. End of story. Someone denied the legal means and opportunities to acquire the tools necessary to commit an offense will simply acquire them illegally. Someone who already has contempt for human life, and especially someone who has conspired and planned to take human lives in such an extensive and comprehensive manner, will not be bound or deterred by any law or regulation, only by an equal or greater force. The police cannot be everywhere. The RCMP cannot be everywhere. Where use of force in one's own defense, the defense of others, and in the defense of the laws of Canada is reserved by government, law, and regulation exclusively to the state and its representatives in law enforcement, ultimately, no one can ever be safe. It is logically, statistically, and realistically impossible. The fact that the perpetrator of this tragedy targeted and murdered among his 22 victims a police officer, apparently with no compunction, makes the question of what kind of firearms laws or regulations might have prevented this event from ever occurring entirely absurd and irrelevant. Ridiculous even. This was a deranged individual who initially met little or no resistance to his assaults. And the very real question to this is, why was this the case? It might as well be discussed what changes to the Provincial Motor Vehicle Act or the Canada Agricultural Act might have prevented this mass casualty event in Nova Scotia, and that would have had the same effect as discussing or debating firearms. The answer to that is none, and it applies to firearms laws and regulations as well. Not only do the facts contributing to this tragedy condemn the efficacy of today's firearms laws, they condemn the merit and usefulness of firearms laws and legislation, which have been imposed with great controversy, dispute, and expense in Canada over the last 40 years. The rights and freedoms of Canadians have been sacrificed with contempt and derision by governments, not for any practical purposes for public safety, but rather to achieve a means to an end through stimulating a legislative process targeting not criminals or madmen, but the rights, freedoms, property, and culture of Canadians. Now, apparently, there are allegations that the Liberal government may have engaged in political interference in this process and with the RCMP. If this commission focuses exclusively on the firearms issue, it will not have done its job. It will have provided no solutions for public safety, and Canadians will be no closer to the truth of the circumstances and facts that are pertinent to just what precipitated and contributed to this national tragedy. And that will be a tragedy of process and a tragedy of political malfeasance in connection with driving a narrative towards arriving at a preconceived result by a government hell-bent on furthering its civil disarmament agenda. This will have been a politically poisoned process. A more appropriate conclusion to this process would be to find recommendations on how Canadians can be empowered to provide for their own self-defense and in defense of their fellow Canadians and the laws of Canada. The lack of discussion on this in this process is glaring in its absence, and it is not unnoticed. This concludes my submission to the Commission. I thank the Commission and will end by saying Canada's National Firearms Association will never cease fighting for fundamental firearms law reforms that target individuals, such as the perpetrator of the Nova Scotia mass casualty event, the criminals and sociopaths who now indiscriminately and without fear of the law commit acts of violence on the streets of our cities and communities, and will continue to fight for reforms that truly respect the rights, freedoms, property, and culture of Canadians. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hagan. Mr. Gultaka.
Thank you. Good speech from Blair. I appreciate that. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Normally, I don't just read a statement, but in these circumstances, I'm going to read a fair bit because I have limited time and I want to make sure that I don't miss anything. So I guess to begin, when the commission was first established, we had an opportunity to participate, and I immediately submitted a request, and we were granted standing. And then part of that process, I ended up being contacted by some surviving family members of the victims, and I had the opportunity to chat with them about their feelings around this whole experience. And that experience in itself reinforced my belief that the reason for all of this is to bring justice to the victims. And my understanding of that justice in this case is, number one, bringing to the public's view what actually happened on April 18th and 19th, 2020. And secondly, what we can do to avoid this from happening again, if that is at all possible. I can only imagine what a painful experience it is for friends and family of the victims to go through all of this for a period of around 2 years. It's unimaginable to me. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that it's been quite clear that there have been groups and individuals that have viewed this tragedy as an opportunity to get their message out or to use this suffering as a platform for their agenda. And in my opinion, this behavior is abhorrent, but it happens every single time there's a tragedy like this, every time. And I think we can do better. And the reason why I bring that up is this is why, while I'm representing the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, or the CCFR, I have strictly limited my comments to my expertise and to the facts of this specific case without deviation. This is the reason our group was given standing, and I take that very seriously. All that to say, my comments today will, again, apply to the mass casualty event that is in front of us and answer to the mandate of this commission as at least I understand it. Earlier this year, we submitted our preliminary report as part of our work for the commission. At this point, I've had the benefit of 5 months of additional information provided by the commission. After considering the foregoing, very little has changed about our opinion. In review, a simplistic summary of the facts of this case are as follows, and this is going to be very similar to what Mr. Hagan said. Fact: a violent and erratically behaved resident of Nova Scotia committed the largest spree shooting in Canadian history. This individual was well known by police on a few different levels. It's complicated, but I'm not going to get into that. This individual had a history of violent behavior, including the issuance of death threats going back beyond a decade. Another fact: this individual and his concerning behavior was well known in the community, going well back beyond a decade. It was well known that this individual had engaged in other unlawful behavior, including being in unauthorized possession of firearms, a very serious criminal offense in Canada. It was an open secret in the community. Fact: it was established that all the firearms used to commit the murders were illegally smuggled into Canada from the United States. Now, just in case anyone's unsure, firearm prohibitions in Canada are not enforceable in other countries, just to make sure everybody understands that. Now, he was in possession of one domestically sourced firearm obtained through fraud, though there's no conclusive evidence that he used that firearm against anyone during the mass casualty event, nor was it necessary for him to do so. He had other options. And last, it has been established that the perpetrator did not possess a firearms license in Canada at any time, nor did he have any demonstrable links to the firearms community in Canada. These are the non-controversial facts of the mass casualty event, and it's my understanding that these facts are not disputed by anyone in this inquiry. From the perspective of the regulation of firearms in Canada, laws or regulations that may have had some effect in preventing or mitigating the mass casualty are fairly easy to identify. The reason is because there were almost none of them. The only regulation that could have had any influence on this tragedy is found in Section 117 of the Criminal Code. And that regulation, as it is today, was more than sufficient to serve its intended purpose. So in plain language, Section 117 allows a peace officer to apply to a court for a search warrant, or in some cases, search without a warrant with the intent to seize firearms or weapons or other prohibited devices in the interest of public safety. It seems that the opportunity to use Section 117 presented itself on a few occasions, particularly in light of death threats made by the perpetrator, the frequent discharge of illegally possessed firearms, members of the community being aware of this possession, and a handful of concerning interactions with police. Again, some complicated ones, but those are beyond my purview. So I'll add that there's a high degree of frontline police discretion involved in deploying Section 117, the powers of search and seizure there. And I'd be interested in further analysis on this from experts who are more qualified than I am on this topic itself. So what I'm saying is, this is an important aspect of this inquiry, and I sincerely hope, I'm almost desperately hope, that the commission pursues an explanation of why these regulatory measures weren't exercised. They are well understood by frontline police officers. So again, this is a very serious problem. Now, I do want to hypothesize for just a moment about what I just suggested. So maybe, if we're just throwing it around, maybe local law enforcement could have acted on one of these complaints that they received over the preceding decade. Maybe they dug around a little bit and they're able to obtain a search warrant to search. Maybe the perpetrator was too smart and no firearms were found. Alternatively, maybe firearms were found. And maybe through some lengthy legal process, the perpetrator was no longer able to legally cross the border into the United States, which were the numerous trips that he made smuggling these firearms back from a different jurisdiction. Would that have affected his ability to source the firearms he used? These are interesting questions, but I might suggest that with this individual, his level of intellectual competence, his financial resources, he would have likely found a way to achieve his goals regardless. We've seen that in other crimes in Canada time and time again. But again, the Section 117 powers were the only applicable laws that may have possibly made a difference. It seems they weren't used. Now, on the contrary, every other firearm regulation in Canada had absolutely no effect in mitigating or preventing this tragedy, not a single one, not magazine size restrictions, not possession offenses, storage, transportation regulations, certainly not any Australian-style gun buybacks, or the innumerable prohibitions that we've seen before or after the mass casualty event. Not a single law could have had any influence on what happened. If all firearms were banned in Canada for the last 100 years, I've said this before, this tragedy would have happened exactly the same way. There's no way around it. It's a physical reality. It's physically true. So, and I know it's an uncomfortable truth for people involved in this inquiry, but it's the way it is, and that in itself is difficult. A little more undeniably true information. Adam and Carol Fisher were in their home, and I mentioned this before in our first oral presentation. We're in their home when the perpetrator drove up their driveway. The perpetrator was acquainted with the Fishers and knew Adam Fisher was a legal gun owner. It also so happens that Adam Fisher had a legally owned loaded shotgun at the ready, that's my understanding, while Carol Fisher was on the line with 911. I'm not privy to exactly what happened, but I'd be interested in knowing more. But I'll say this, Adam and Carol Fisher survived this interaction with the perpetrator. And I'll also add, not a shot was fired. It seems like the perpetrator was deterred, but we don't know that for sure. I can say this though, if there was a gun ban in Canada for the last 100 years, like I mentioned, is there anyone who thinks that this interaction would have ended the way that it did? These are the only people to survive an interaction with the perpetrator at their home. They're the only ones. If the intent of all this is to save innocent lives, this part of the story needs to be honestly and seriously considered. It's part of the fact pattern. I realize it's inconvenient for a few people involved in this inquiry on the periphery, but if we're here for the right reasons, this needs to be highlighted and considered in the Commission's final report. In any case, I intend to pursue a little bit more information on a few of the things that I mentioned today, and I'd like to invite everyone to read our final report to be submitted to the Commission in early October and reply submissions in late October. So I'll end it there, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Giltaka. We will now ask Ms. Joanna Birnbaum.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I am Joanna Birnbaum, and I'm co-counsel with Mercedes Perez for the Canadian Coalition for Gun Control. The coalition, of course, wants to start by expressing its sincere condolences to the families, friends, and community of the victims of the mass casualty that occurred on April 18 and 19, 2020. As some members of the coalition unfortunately know only too well, the impact on your lives is unimaginable, and the coalition will continue to seek ways to prevent such tragedies. The coalition is comprised of over 200 organizations, and its members include the victims of many other mass shootings. The coalition was founded in response to the mass casualty at the École Polytechnique in Montreal in 1989 that killed 14 women and injured many others. Since 1989, the coalition has been a recognized domestically and internationally as a leading voice and expert on firearms and firearms policy, including in the context of more than 15 firearms-related mass casualty events that have occurred in the past 2 decades in Canada. Commissioners, the facts in this case underscore the recognized links between the proliferation of firearms and firearms-related violence. The presence of a firearm increases the risk of serious injury and death, whether from homicide, domestic violence, suicide, or unintentional injury. And while these are all distinct forms of violence, the Commission was provided with evidence of the links between mass shootings and domestic violence, the link between mass shootings and extreme expressions of hate, mass shootings and suicide. The presence of a firearm also increases the potential for multiple victims and for mass casualty events. And it's important to highlight that this mass casualty occurred at a time when there has been a very significant proliferation of firearms globally and in Canada, including a dramatic increase in handguns, as well as an increase in gun violence. While rifles and shotguns are used for hunting and pest control, most Canadians support a complete ban on military-style semi-automatic assault weapons like the Ruger Mini 14 and a ban on handguns. Research from industrialized countries such as the UK and Australia, as well as the US, suggests that the availability of firearms generally and specific types of firearms, handguns, and semi-automatic assault weapons is linked to firearm death and injury, including femicide. Additionally, while mass shootings are relatively rare events, and we hope they remain so, and the coalition is committed to that end, it is important to remember that they are most often committed by legal gun owners with legal guns or with guns that were at one time legally owned. Finally, the evidence is that mass shootings occur less frequently in countries with stricter gun controls. Commissioners, my submissions today will start by briefly identifying relevant facts from this mass casualty that inform the coalition's recommendations. I'll then address other contextual evidence before this commission, and in particular, the importance of a public health approach to reduce the harms of firearms through education and through the implementation, enforcement, and oversight of regulatory rules and measures. And finally, I'll then turn to 10 of the recommendations that the coalition asks this commission to adopt, which recommendations the coalition will obviously set out in more detail in our written brief. In terms of the facts relating to April 2020, in this inquiry, as in so many other inquests and mass casualty events, there were many warning signs, and you've heard about that repeatedly over the past few days. Family, friends, and community members were aware that the perpetrator had a pattern of violent behavior and had illegal guns. Some, including or perhaps most particularly the police, normalized the perpetrator's behavior or didn't understand the risks. Some community members, for very good reason, were too afraid to report or faced multiple systemic barriers and oppressions in doing so. Some didn't know where or how to report. Some had concerns about lack of anonymity, which is a particular issue in smaller communities. Others believed that reporting would be ineffective, particularly given the known friendly relationships between the perpetrator and the police. And these are barriers that are not unique to Portapique, and they're not unique to Nova Scotia. Second, in spite of the warning signs, there were gaps and lost opportunities in policing and in the enforcement of existing laws, contrary to the submissions of the organizations that you heard immediately before me. And this too is reflective of a pervasive pattern and problem across Canada. And the coalition will make recommendations for closing the gaps and for much more rigorous enforcement of existing laws. Third, the perpetrator was not a licensed firearm owner, yet he easily managed to acquire firearms in Canada and the US. As the Commission is aware, of the 5 firearms recovered by the RCMP from the perpetrator's vehicle at the Enfield Big Stop, 4 had been smuggled from the US. But the perpetrator's 5th gun, the Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, was acquired from the estate of a deceased friend in Canada, no questions asked. Further, some of his ammunition was acquired in Canada with the assistance of licensed gun owners. So situating these facts more broadly, it's important that the Commission focus on the fact that more than half of crime guns in Canada that are traced originate from Canadian sources. All illegal guns start as a legal gun. Diversion of firearms and ammunition in Canada from legal to illegal markets was present in this case. The problem was not only a cross-border smuggling problem. I'm turning now to the contextual evidence before the Commission. Dr. Nagin, who testified at the inquiry on September 6 of 2022, was one expert voice among others who emphasized the need for a public health approach to gun-related injury and violence. The coalition strongly supports this approach. Commissioners, firearms-related deaths are the second leading cause of death from injury among youth in Canada after motor vehicle accidents, including drunk driving accidents. Yet there is minimal to no public education around firearms risks as compared to drinking and driving. And while urban violence receives considerable attention, rates of firearm violence are in fact higher in rural communities, particularly murders of women, suicides, and murders of police officers. And as I mentioned already, it can't be ignored that the rate of firearm homicides has been increasing year over year over year in Canada since 2013, which increase has happened to coincide with the loosening of gun laws in Canada and the proliferation of access to firearms. Prior to 2013, firearm death and injury in Canada, including firearm homicide of women, were declining in a similar pattern to what was observed in Australia. The coalition's submission is simple. The evidence shows that more guns do not make us safer. In fact, guns in the home are associated with an increased risk of homicide and suicide. Research shows that defensive gun use is extremely rare. Studies from the US and elsewhere show that permissive gun laws, including carrying concealed weapons laws, do not deter crime and in fact are associated with higher risk of murder, rape, and other forms of violence. There is no evidence that armed security guards or armed citizens stop mass shootings. As noted by a 2014 study of mass shootings in the US, and I'm quoting, between the beginning and the end of a typical killing rampage, the only interruption that makes the shooter pause is the need to reload or to search for new targets, end of quote. Arming for self-protection is not supported by Canadian law and is not a solution to combating violent crime. Now, the coalition acknowledges that there are legitimate reasons for certain citizens to own certain kinds of guns, for hunting, for subsistence, for collections, and sport activities. The coalition also acknowledges that rural and urban perspectives on firearms and firearm controls differ. But so do the perspectives of men and women. A gendered analysis of the support for access to firearms is critical. A 2003 Environics study showed that while a majority of gun owners oppose registration of firearms, the majority of people living with those gun owners, their wives, their families, supported it. In 2009, an extensive University of New Brunswick study on rural family violence found that 66% of women with firearms in their home said that knowing that firearms were present made them more fearful for their safety. And 70% said the presence of firearms affected their decision whether to tell others about abuse or escape abuse. So with those submissions in mind, the coalition will address 10 of the recommendations that will be laid out in the coalition's written submissions. And I'll start with recommendation 1. The coalition calls on the commission to identify the proliferation of firearms in Canada and the rates of firearm injuries and deaths as an urgent public health concern that requires an immediate and coordinated response from all levels of government utilizing a public health approach. Amongst other benefits, a public health approach guides community standards and expectations. And so using my earlier example of drinking and driving, as a country, we no longer tolerate drinking and driving and have set strict boundaries around permissible behavior. As a result of really effective public health campaigns, we have the knowledge and feel empowered to intervene when someone is about to drink and drive, including with friends and family members and in social and other settings. A similar cultural shift in respect of the risks of firearms would assist in ensuring that community members are better able to speak out, are better able to identify the risks, and that enforcement agencies respond appropriately when firearms-related concerns have been identified. Recommendation number 2, flowing from adopting a public health approach, the coalition calls on the commission to recommend the establishment of a national firearms hotline. The purpose of the hotline would be multifold. It would allow citizens to report concerns about firearms directly to staff accountable to the commissioner of the RCMP and not to their local police force, which proved problematic, for example, for Brenda Forbes in this case. It would avoid the problem identified in Dr. Sukier's evidence on September 6th, when she mentioned the experience of a coalition member who tried really, really hard to report a significant firearm concern to a provincial firearms office and was put on hold literally for 24 hours before giving up. The hotline would provide a safer place than local police for community members to at least initially obtain information on gun laws and options for reporting. It would enhance accountability and transparency frameworks and provide an additional resource for firearms-related data collection. The Commission should also recommend that the launch of the hotline be accompanied by a comprehensive public education campaign to increase awareness about the risks associated with firearms in the home and to publicize the hotline as a resource for Canadians to direct questions and concerns. Recommendation number 3, or areas of recommendation number 3. The Coalition calls on the Commission to recommend that loopholes in the existing laws be addressed and that the regulatory priority be on public safety and the right to be safe. Holding a firearms license is a privilege, not a right. Firearms regulation is intended to allow individuals to use firearms for legitimate purposes, principally hunting, subsistence, cultural activities, and pest control, while rigorously reducing the risk that firearms will be misused. So prohibiting military-style semi-automatic assault weapons and handguns appropriately restricts access when the risks are too high and legitimate purposes not justified. The Coalition recommends the implementation of the ban on military-style assault weapons, and further, that the criminal code should be amended to more precisely define military-style assault weapons to ensure that manufacturers have fewer opportunities to circumvent the intent of the law with new models and new modifications to existing models. Legislative restrictions and amendments should also be extended to prohibit possession of handguns. And ideally, loopholes in the law would be addressed by making it a criminal offense to import, trade, or possess a firearm that is not on a prescribed list of lawful firearms, so that there aren't any gaps that can be exploited. Recommendation number 4. John Parkins, who gave evidence on September 6th and is the firearms manager for Nova Scotia, called for clarification on when a prohibition order imposes a duty on the chief firearms officer to suspend or revoke a license. The risk factors between domestic violence and firearms violence, including mass casualties, are well established. So if a person is convicted of a domestic violence or analogous or related offense, their license should be automatically revoked and immediate follow-up to identify and retrieve weapons undertaken. If they're charged, the license should be automatically suspended. And the Coalition further recommends that to avoid the lack of clarity that Mr. Parkin discussed, when, for example, charges are diverted, the license should remain suspended and the onus should shift to the license holder to demonstrate their continued eligibility for a license. And while the Coalition has concerns about aspects of Bill C-21, and particularly the downloading onto individual citizens, the burden of applying to the courts to have licenses revoked or firearms removed, which should be an obligation of the state, amendments to the criminal law that automatically revoke or suspend firearms licenses in the context of domestic violence and related charges are important and should be enacted immediately. More generally, where there are concerns about hate crimes, about suicide, about domestic violence, or where the license holder is a threat to himself or others, authorities should rigorously screen and err on the side of caution. The burden of proof should be on gun owners to demonstrate that they are not a threat or a risk. Recommendation number 5. In this case, the Ruger Mini 14 was still classified as an unrestricted firearm prior to May 2020. As a result, the records of ownership of 6 million unrestricted firearms were destroyed in 2012 with the abolition of the Firearms Registry. And the 2012 legislation, when it came into effect, did not restore the 1977 legislative record-keeping requirements for sales or transfers. So what did that mean? That meant that it was impossible to trace the Ruger Mini 14 that belonged to Tom Evans. The coalition calls on the commission to make a finding that the ability to track sales and hold gun owners accountable for their firearms is absolutely necessary to effectively enforce the firearms regulatory regime. Tracking sales and tracing firearms ownership is critical to stemming the diversion of firearms, in this case from a deceased license holder, and also for informing policy. Recommendation number 6. The illegal transfer of the Ruger Mini 14 is but one example of loopholes in the existing firearms legislation that could have had an impact in this case. When firearms licenses expire or a license holder dies, there is currently little to no follow-up. The onus is on executors or family members to alert police to the need for deactivation or destruction. The coalition calls on the commission to recommend immediate administrative and legal changes to prevent the unlawful transfer of firearms from estates and to track the firearms belonging to owners with expired license. These changes can include, for example, the creation of mechanisms to transfer information from government databases, such as vital statistics, to firearms offices, along with a protocol that police are required to follow up and identify and retrieve guns in a timely way upon immediate notice of death or the expiry of a license. Recommendation number 7, back to a public health approach. A public health approach to the risks of firearm access and possession is part of rigorous enforcement. And that, of course, is captured by all of the recommendations that the coalition is presenting to the commission today. For the purposes of effective screening, review, renewal, suspension, or revocation of licenses, the coalition recommends that all provinces and territories impose a mandatory duty to report on healthcare professionals where individuals are assessed as a risk to themselves and others and may have access to firearms. And along with that would be education of these professionals of the risks of firearms, which, for example, appear to have been very tragically lacking in the Desmond case. Recommendation number 8. The coalition notes that generalized statements have been made in its inquiry about the border with the US being the major gun problem in Canada. But there's little information being consistently and accurately collected on the source of crime guns in Canada, whether the firearm was legally owned, whether it was stolen, whether it was illegally purchased, or whether it was smuggled into Canada. No province requires the police send all crime guns for tracing, and there is no national firearms tracing database. The coalition therefore recommends that all federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal police agencies, as well as the CBSA, be required to submit for tracing all confiscated firearms. The commission should also recommend that a national firearms tracing database be established to track and record the results of tracing efforts. Recommendation number 9. To address firearms smuggling across the US-Canada border, which was also, of course, a component to the facts before you in relation to April of 2020. The coalition recommends that the federal government make it a priority to confirm a bilateral agreement with the US designed to prevent smuggling and trafficking of firearms. This agreement should include, among a number of elements, number 1, securing a commitment by the US to fully investigate, prosecute, and where necessary, extradite American residents, citizens, and companies who sell or otherwise transfer firearms to Canadians when the US citizen knew or ought to have known the firearm would be transferred to a Canadian who is not licensed to own the firearm or was otherwise illegal. And so, for example, in this case, it does not appear that any steps were taken to hold the perpetrator's friend, Sean Conlow, criminally accountable. Secondly, that agreement should secure a commitment from the US to fully investigate how guns are being transported from the US into Canada for illegal possession and use, including straw purchases and sales to gun traffickers. It should also include a commitment by the US to increase enforcement, inspection, and investigation of gun dealers near the Canadian border who who are trafficking and smuggling into Canada, as well as a requirement that gun dealers near the border and in source states screen for indicators of straw purchasers and trafficking. And finally, recommendation 10, which is by no means 10th in the order of priority. Throughout this inquiry, the Commission has heard time and again about data gaps. Transparency, accountability, and evidence-based policymaking are impossible without, well, not impossible, but are less ideal without good data. In terms of accountability, in the enforcement of firearms regulations, the Commissioner of the RCMP, who as we know is also the Commissioner of Firearms, produces an annual report, but the data contained in that report is minimal. For example, there's no annual data, either publicly released or at all, on the number of firearms licenses refused, suspended, expired, or revoked, or the reasons those actions were undertaken. Aggregate information on possession and acquisition licenses for restricted weapons can only be obtained through an ATIP or FOI request. Gender disaggregated data are hard to access. There's no data on the outcomes when licenses are suspended or revoked or prohibition orders are made in terms of retrieval of firearms or the time it took for steps to be undertaken. There's no public data on the number of times a year that the Chief Firearms Office receives information that could affect the ongoing eligibility of a firearms license holder and what steps were taken to investigate. The Coalition therefore calls for a review and revision of the types of data required to be collected by the Chief Firearms Officer to strengthen accountability and transparency in the administration of the law. There are also significant data gaps on gun-related violence, particularly gender data gaps. The Coalition calls for further review and augmentation of the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey to collect, in every case, comprehensive, consistent, and specific data on the type of firearm used, the offender-victim relationship, who owned the firearm at issue, how the firearm was stored, and whether the person who used the gun was licensed, among other data. Canada needs a comprehensive national database on gun-related assaults and femicide, and that data should be compiled not only from police services, but also from coroners, hospitals, courts, and social service agencies. And I'll conclude now. I began these submissions by emphasizing the importance of this commission recommending a comprehensive public health approach to gun violence. Paired with strong gun controls and more rigorous and transparent enforcement of gun laws, a public health approach will help to set community standards and expectations. A statement of principle by this commission that firearms are a serious public health problem, and a recommendation that Canada implement a broad public health approach supported by comprehensive data and rigorous regulatory enforcement and public safety change will address some of the things that went wrong in Portapique and other mass casualties and will be a meaningful and lasting step toward prevention. And the Coalition thanks the commissioners for receiving these submissions this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Ms. Birnbaum.
Just want to check with Mr. Van Woord if there's anyone that was planning to go this afternoon. Okay. No, thank you. Just thanks to all the participants and their counsel for your submissions, which of course we'll continue to consider carefully. And if any of you that are watching the proceedings today have an idea for change that can strengthen community safety, please do share it with us. The process is outlined on the website, and we're accepting your submissions until the end of September. Tomorrow is our final day of public proceedings. We'll continue to hear more final submissions from participants before delivering final remarks to conclude proceedings and to reiterate our next steps as we continue to make progress towards sharing the final report and recommendations. Of course, like you, we're closely monitoring the weather here in Nova Scotia. We'll continue to do so this evening. Our team will contact participant council and media if there are any changes to tomorrow's proceedings. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. The proceedings are adjourned until September 23rd, 2022 at 9:30 a.m.